a pristine wildlife paradise, built by hand to hide a dark secret. Stay with me. If you walked into the Savannah National Wildlife Refuge today, you'd swear you were standing in untouched wilderness. Alligators drift through dark water. Bald eagles circle overhead. Thousands of migratory birds settle into thick marsh grass like they've done it forever. Nearly 30,000 acres of what looks like nature, exactly as it always was. But almost none of what you're seeing is actually natural. It's an illusion, and a remarkably convincing one. Every channel, every earthen bank, every quiet pool was shaped by human hands more than 200 years ago, for reasons that had nothing to do with wildlife at all. By the end of this video, you won't be able to look at a peaceful marsh the same way again. This is the story of how a swamp became one of the most profitable industrial landscapes in early America. How that profit was built entirely on forced human labor, and how when that system finally collapsed, nature quietly took the whole thing back. Before any of this existed, the land along the Georgia and South Carolina border was something else entirely. A dense, flooded cypress swamp, the kind of place where sunlight barely reached the ground, and the Savannah River rose and fell with the tides every single day, turning the forest floor into shallow water and back again on a rhythm nobody controlled. It was wild, dense, and almost impossible to move through. Nobody farmed it. Nobody really could. That changed in the early 1700s, when colonial planters realized something the swamp itself had been quietly offering the whole time. That same tidal rhythm that made the land impossible to farm conventionally was actually perfect for growing one very specific, very valuable crop: rice. There was just one problem: turning a flooded, tree-choked swamp into a working agricultural system wasn't something a handful of farmers could do with axes and shovels on a weekend. It required a staggering, almost unimaginable amount of labor, sustained over years, and the planters had already decided exactly how they intended to get it. Thousands of enslaved people were forced into these swamps to do the work, many of them brought specifically because they carried knowledge of rice cultivation from West Africa, knowledge the planters themselves didn't actually possess and desperately needed. They cut down towering cypress trees by hand, standing in water for hours at a time, often working in conditions that bred disease and exhaustion in equal measure. They dragged stumps out of thick mud using nothing but rope, muscle, and desperation. They dug thousands of miles of ditches by hand, one shovel of mud at a time, an effort so vast that historians still struggle to fully calculate the total volume of earth moved by hand across the whole region. And they piled that same heavy river mud into massive earthen walls, dikes built precisely enough to hold back an entire tidal river, or release it exactly when the fields needed flooding. One mistake in that engineering could drown an entire season's crop. There was no margin for error, and the people doing this work had no say in any of it, no wages for it, and no choice about whether to do it at all. Within a few decades, an ancient, untouched swamp had been completely erased from the map. In its place, flat, open, treeless fields stretching for miles, built entirely on forced human suffering, and engineered with a level of precision that planters back in England would have struggled to believe was possible. None of this rice was grown to feed the people who grew it. It was a global export crop from the very beginning, and it became famous enough to earn its own nickname, Carolina Gold, named for its rich color and its staggering value on the open market. Once harvested, the grain had to be threshed, husked, and polished before it was even fit to ship, an entire secondary layer of labor-intensive processing that happened largely by hand inside buildings like the winnowing houses found on plantations across the region. Once finally ready, the rice was hauled to the nearby port of Savannah, loaded onto cargo ships, and sent across the entire Atlantic Ocean, straight to the docks of London. At the time, London was the financial center of the world, and Carolina Gold rice became a genuine status symbol in wealthy British households, served at formal dinners as proof of taste and means. The profit margins were enormous, and that money didn't stay in the swamp. It flowed straight into London's banks, its trading houses, its grand estates, fueling the growth of an empire that stretched across the entire globe. A merchant sitting comfortably in a London coffee house, sipping tea and reading shipping reports, was directly connected, whether he ever thought about it or not, to the suffering of people standing waist-deep in Georgia mud thousands of miles away. The same ships that carried rice eastward often carried enslaved people westward on earlier voyages, the entire Atlantic trade system functioning as one continuous, interlocking economic machine rather than separate, unrelated transactions. This landscape wasn't shaped by nature. It was shaped by demand, by consumer taste, by a financial system that stretched across an ocean and never once had to look at the people paying its real cost. At the center of this entire operation sat a property called Laurel Hill Plantation, and if you visit the refuge today, you can actually drive directly through what used to be its grounds without ever realizing it. By 1825, Laurel Hill had become a fully operational industrial complex disguised as a farm. A two-story overseer's house, positioned deliberately to allow constant visual control over the workforce below. Large barns. A winnowing house built specifically for processing grain at scale, and rows of small, cramped dwellings that housed more than 150 enslaved people, the entire workforce that made this operation function, living in conditions deliberately kept minimal, while the wealth their labor generated flowed elsewhere entirely. The engineering here was genuinely sophisticated for its time, which somehow makes the human cost behind it even harder to sit with. Workers built a tide-powered rice mill along the Little Back River, using the natural rise and fall of the tide itself to grind grain without any external fuel source at all. A remarkably elegant solution that required precise knowledge of local water patterns built up over generations of forced observation and labor. By 1833, the plantation had upgraded to a steam-powered mill, a serious technological investment that tells you exactly how much money was flowing through this single property, and how confident its owners were that this system would continue indefinitely. To control water across hundreds of acres of fields, workers relied on something called a rice trunk, a wooden box hidden inside the dike itself, fitted with hinged doors on either end. By raising or lowering those doors, using nothing but the natural pressure of the tide, a single enslaved worker could control water levels across an enormous stretch of farmland with remarkable precision. It was brilliant engineering. It was also a system that depended entirely on forced labor to design, build, and operate. Every single day, for decades, this entire system felt permanent, almost unshakable, right up until it wasn't. When the Civil War broke out in the 1860s, the Southern economy that depended on systems exactly like this one began to fracture. The Savannah River region itself became a contested military zone, caught directly in the path of the conflict, with naval movements and skirmishes disrupting the river traffic that the entire rice trade depended on to function. But the real turning point wasn't a battle, it was abolition. When slavery finally ended, the enslaved workforce that had built and operated this entire system was free, and they left, taking with them not just their labor but generations of specialized knowledge about tides, water control, and rice cultivation that the plantation owners had never bothered to learn themselves because they had never needed to. Plantation owners, many of whom had never personally understood the complex tidal engineering their entire operation depended on, suddenly had no workforce capable of running it. Rice cultivation across the region simply collapsed, not gradually, but almost immediately. Some owners attempted to hire formerly enslaved workers back as paid labor, but the economics no longer worked the way they once had, and the dikes and trunks that required constant daily maintenance began to fail one by one. The steam mill at Laurel Hill sat abandoned, was briefly repurposed as a local tavern, and was eventually torn down entirely in the early 1900s. And the moment human hands stopped maintaining this landscape, nature didn't hesitate. The carefully controlled rice fields flooded permanently. Native marsh plants, smartweed, wild rice, duck potato, moved back in almost immediately, reclaiming ground that had been forced into agricultural submission for over a century. A landscape built entirely on human suffering, quietly transformed itself back into something that looked, on the surface, completely wild again. By the 1920s, conservationists noticed something nobody had planned for. These abandoned rice fields had accidentally become one of the most critical stopover points for migratory birds anywhere along the entire Atlantic coast, offering exactly the kind of shallow, plant-rich freshwater habitat that ducks, herons, and countless other species needed and were rapidly losing elsewhere along the developed coastline. In 1927, the federal government purchased the land outright and established what eventually became the Savannah National Wildlife Refuge. Here's the part that genuinely surprises most people. Refuge staff today don't manage this land as pure, hands-off wilderness. They actively maintain the exact same water control system built by enslaved laborers nearly 2 centuries ago, because removing it entirely would actually destroy the very habitat that makes this place so valuable for wildlife in the first place. The gravel roads visitors drive along are the same earthen dikes, hand-dug in the 1700s. The modern water gates sit in almost the exact same locations where wooden rice trunks once operated, doing essentially the same job those original devices were built for, just with steel and concrete instead of hand-cut timber. If you walk the trails carefully, you can still find physical fragments of that history, including a 7-foot-deep brick cistern from a nearby plantation, once used to collect rainwater, now sitting quietly among the live oak trees as if it had always belonged there, a small, easily overlooked reminder of exactly what this land used to be. So the next time you see a photograph of this refuge, alligators sunning peacefully, eagles circling over still water, understand what you're actually looking at. Not untouched nature, a landscape engineered by forced human labor, financed by a global trade network stretching all the way to London, abandoned the moment that labor system collapsed, and quietly reclaimed by the same wilderness it once replaced. The peaceful marsh and the brutal history beneath it aren't two separate stories. They're the same story, layered on top of each other, still visible if you know exactly where to look. If you want to see how this same pattern played out at other plantations across the American South, let me know in the comments, and I'll take you there next.